The sound of shattering glass echoed through the parlor as Katherine Bennett's father hurled her mother's crystal vase against the marble fireplace, his face crimson with rage as he screamed that she was no daughter of his. It was a sweltering afternoon in August 1878, and Catherine's world was crumbling faster than the fragments now scattered across the imported Persian rug in their mansion on the hill, overlooking Marysville, California. She stood there in her pale blue day dress, her hands trembling at her sides, refusing to cry even as her father's words cut deeper than any blade ever could. "You disgrace this family," he bellowed, his jowls quivering with fury. Richard Bennett was a railroad tycoon, a man who had built his fortune on the backs of countless workers, and he expected his daughter to marry into an even wealthier family to expand his empire. Instead, Katherine had refused the proposal of Jonathan Whitmore, the son of a San Francisco banking magnate, claiming she would not marry a man she did not love. "I did not raise you to be a romantic fool. You have one purpose, girl, and that is to secure this family's position in society. I will not marry a man who treats his servants like animals and who drinks himself into a stupor every evening," Katherine said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. She was 20 years old, and every day of her life had been carefully orchestrated by her father. She had attended the finest finishing schools, learned to speak French and Italian, could play the piano with the skill of a concert musician, and yet none of it mattered because she had dared to defy him. Her father's eyes narrowed to slits. "Then you are no longer welcome in this house. If you will not do your duty, you will not benefit from my protection or my fortune." Catherine's mother sat on the velvet settee, her delicate hands folded in her lap, her eyes cast downward. She had not spoken a single word in Catherine's defense, had not even looked up when her husband began his tirade. Margaret Bennett had learned long ago that contradicting her husband only brought his wrath upon herself, and she had become a ghost in her own home, floating through the rooms with the substance of morning mist. "Mother," Katherine pleaded, turning toward the only other person in the room who might intervene. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, but she remained silent, her fingers twisting the lace handkerchief in her lap until Katherine thought it might tear. "Get out," her father said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his shouting. "Take nothing but the clothes on your back. You are dead to me." Katherine felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. She had known her father was a hard man, but she had not imagined he would truly cast her out. She waited for him to relent, to say he had not meant it, but he simply pointed toward the door, his hand as steady as his resolve. With her head held high, Katherine walked out of the parlor, through the grand foyer with its sweeping staircase and crystal chandelier imported from France, and out the front door into the blazing California sun. She heard the door slam behind her with a finality that made her knees weak, but she forced herself to keep walking down the long drive lined with roses her mother had planted years ago. By the time she reached the gates of the estate, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She had no money, no belongings except the dress she wore and the small locket around her neck that had belonged to her grandmother. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the road stretched before her, empty and dusty, leading into a town where everyone knew her as Richard Bennett's daughter but where no one would dare help her now that she had been disowned. Marysville was a growing town situated at the confluence of the Yuba and Feather Rivers, a place that had boomed during the gold rush 2 decades earlier and had managed to sustain itself through agriculture and trade. Katherine walked along the main street, feeling the stares of shopkeepers and townspeople who recognized her. She saw women whispering behind their hands, saw men tip their hats with uncertain expressions, unsure whether to acknowledge her or pretend they had not seen her at all. Hunger gnawed at her stomach as the afternoon wore into evening. She had not eaten since breakfast, and the heat had left her parched and dizzy. She found herself standing outside the general store, wondering if anyone inside would show her kindness, but the memory of the whispers kept her feet planted on the wooden sidewalk. As darkness began to fall, Katherine realized she had nowhere to sleep. The hotel would not take her without payment, and she knew better than to think any of her former friends would risk their own reputations by harboring her. She walked toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land, and found a small grove of oak trees near a creek. She settled beneath the largest one, her back against the rough bark, and finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came in great, gasping sobs that shook her entire body. Everything she had known, everyone she had loved, had been stripped away in a single afternoon. She thought of her mother's silence, of her father's cold dismissal, and wondered how her life had come to this point. As the stars emerged overhead, bright and indifferent to her suffering, Katherine wrapped her arms around herself and tried to find some scrap of hope to cling to. She must have dozed off despite her discomfort, because she woke to the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Fear shot through her as she scrambled to her feet, pressing herself against the tree trunk. A rider emerged from the darkness, leading 2 horses, and Katherine's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Easy there," a deep voice called out. "I am not going to hurt you." The rider dismounted, and in the moonlight, Katherine could make out the figure of a tall man wearing a wide-brimmed hat and dusty traveling clothes. He moved slowly, as if approaching a skittish animal, and held his hands where she could see them. "What are you doing out here alone?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern. Katherine's pride warred with her desperation. "That is none of your concern." The man stopped a few feet away, and she could see his face now. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, with strong features shadowed by several days' worth of stubble. His eyes, even in the dim light, seemed kind. "Name is Matthew Cole," he said. "I have been driving cattle up from the south, and I saw you walk into this grove a few hours back. Seemed odd for a lady to be sleeping rough." "I am quite fine, thank you," Katherine said, though her voice shook with exhaustion and fear. Matthew was quiet for a moment, studying her. "You are Richard Bennett's daughter. I have seen you in town." Katherine's chin lifted. "I was." "I am no longer his daughter." Understanding dawned on Matthew's face, and Katherine saw something shift in his expression. Not pity exactly, but empathy. "I know what it is like to be cast out by family," he said quietly. "My father threw me off his land when I was 17 because I would not help him cheat his neighbors out of their water rights." Katherine felt something loosen in her chest. "Where did you go?" "Found work on various ranches, learned the cattle trade, saved my money. Now I have got a small spread about 10 miles north of here. Nothing fancy, but it is mine." He paused, then added, "I have got a spare room. Well, more like a storage room, but it has got a roof and walls. You are welcome to it until you figure out what to do next." Every lesson Katherine had ever learned about proper behavior told her to refuse. A respectable woman did not go off alone with a strange man, did not accept charity that could compromise her reputation. But what reputation did she have left? Her father had seen to that. And the alternative was spending another night beneath this tree, hungry and vulnerable. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Matthew shrugged. "Because somebody helped me once when I needed it. Figure it is my turn to pass it along." Katherine looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. She took a deep breath and nodded. "I accept your offer, Mr. Cole, thank you." "Just Matthew," he said, a small smile crossing his face. No need for formalities. He helped her onto one of the horses, a gentle mare with a patient disposition, and they rode through the night toward his ranch. Katherine had ridden before, of course, but always side-saddle in a proper riding habit, never astride in a day dress with only a stranger's steadying hand to keep her from falling. The rhythmic movement of the horse and the exhaustion of the day caught up with her, and she found herself swaying in the saddle. "Not much farther," Matthew said, riding close beside her. "Stay with me just a little longer." When they finally arrived at his property, Katherine could make out little in the darkness except for a modest house and a barn. Matthew helped her down from the horse, and she nearly collapsed as her feet touched the ground. Her legs had gone numb from the ride, and her head swam with dizziness. "When did you last eat?" Matthew asked, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. "Yesterday morning," Katherine admitted. "Right, come on then." He led her into the house, which was tidy if Spartan. A table and 2 chairs occupied the main room, along with a stone fireplace and a few shelves holding supplies. He guided her to one of the chairs and quickly set about building a fire and heating up a pot of stew that he had apparently made earlier. Katherine sat in silence, watching him move around the small space with practiced efficiency. Everything about him spoke of self-reliance and capability. He served her a bowl of the stew with a thick slice of bread, and Katherine had to force herself not to devour it like a starving animal. "Thank you," she said between bites. "You did not have to do this." Matthew sat down across from her with his own bowl. "Could not very well let you starve." They ate in companionable silence, and Katherine found herself studying him more carefully. He had strong hands roughened by work, and there was a steadiness about him that she found reassuring. He did not ask prying questions or make her feel like an object of charity. He simply shared his food and his space as though it were the most natural thing in the world. When they had finished eating, Matthew showed her to the small room he had mentioned. It was indeed barely more than a storage area, with crates stacked along one wall and a narrow bed pushed against the other. But the mattress looked clean, and there was a window that let in the moonlight, and to Katherine, it seemed like a palace. "I will bring you some water to wash with in the morning," Matthew said, "and I have got a shirt that might work as a night dress for now. We can figure out clothes and such tomorrow." Katherine nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger. "I do not know how to repay you." "Do not worry about that right now," Matthew said gently. "Just get some rest." He left her alone, closing the door quietly behind him, and Katherine sank onto the bed. The mattress was lumpy and smelled faintly of hay, but it was infinitely better than the hard ground beneath the oak tree. She removed her shoes, which had rubbed blisters on her heels, and lay down fully clothed, too exhausted to care about propriety or the wrinkles in her dress. Sleep claimed her instantly, and for the first time since her father had cast her out, Katherine felt safe. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of a rooster crowing somewhere outside. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, and then the events of the previous day came flooding back. She sat up slowly, her muscles aching from the long ride and the uncomfortable position she had slept in over the past 2 nights. There was a soft knock at the door, and Matthew's voice called out, "I've got that water I promised if you are decent." "Come in," Katherine said, hastily smoothing her tangled hair. Matthew entered carrying a pitcher of water and a basin, along with a towel and what looked like one of his shirts. "Figured you might want to freshen up. I will make breakfast while you do that." After he left, Katherine poured the water into the basin and washed her face and hands, relishing the feeling of clean skin. She looked at herself in the small mirror hanging on the wall and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her hair was a tangled mess, Her dress was wrinkled and dusty, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But there was also something else, something she had not seen before. A spark of determination, perhaps, or the first stirrings of independence. She changed into Matthew's shirt, which hung to her knees and smelled of soap and sunshine. Her dress would need washing, but that could wait. She ventured out into the main room where Matthew was frying eggs and bacon at the stove. "Coffee?" he asked, gesturing to a pot on the table. "Please," Katherine said, sitting down. She had never made her own coffee, had never cooked her own meals or washed her own clothes. The tasks that stretched before her seemed insurmountable. Matthew must have seen something in her expression because he said, "It is a lot, I know. But you will figure it out." "How can you be so sure?" Katherine asked. "Because you are here are not you. You could have crawled back to your father, could have married that man you did not love, but you chose to walk away. That takes guts." Katherine had not thought of it that way. She had felt like a victim, like someone whose life had been destroyed by forces beyond her control. But Matthew was right. She had made a choice, had stood up for what she believed in, even when it cost her everything. They ate breakfast together, and Matthew explained what life was like on his ranch. He had about 200 head of cattle, a few horses, some chickens, and a milk cow. He worked from sunup to sundown most days, mending fences, tending animals, and managing the land. It was hard work, he said, but it was honest and it was his. "I can help," Katherine said suddenly. "I do not know anything about ranching, but I can learn. I do not want to be a burden." Matthew looked at her thoughtfully. "You sure about that? It is not easy work." "I am sure," Katherine said, meeting his eyes. "I need to learn how to take care of myself." So began Katherine's education in ranch life. That first day, Matthew started her with the simplest tasks. He showed her how to feed the chickens and collect their eggs, how to milk the cow, how to pump water from the well. Katherine's hands, which had only ever held embroidery needles and teacups, blistered within hours. Her back ached from bending and lifting, and by midday she was exhausted. But she did not complain. She gritted her teeth and kept working, driven by a stubborn determination to prove she was not useless. Matthew watched her with what might have been approval, offering guidance when she needed it, but otherwise letting her figure things out on her own. That evening, after a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Katherine sat at the table trying to sew up a tear in her dress. She had never been particularly skilled with a needle despite years of embroidery lessons, and she was making a mess of the repair. "Here," Matthew said, pulling his chair closer. "You are pulling the thread too tight. Let me show you." He demonstrated the proper technique, his large hands surprisingly deft with the small needle. Katherine watched closely, then tried again, this time managing a reasonably neat stitch. "Better," Matthew said with an encouraging smile. As the days passed, Katherine fell into a routine. She rose with the sun, helped with the morning chores, spent the afternoon learning new skills, and collapsed into bed each night too tired to dream. Her hands grew calloused, her arms grew stronger, and slowly she began to feel capable. Matthew was a patient teacher, never making her feel stupid for not knowing things that were second nature to him. He taught her how to ride properly, how to recognize when an animal was sick, how to cook simple meals. In return, Katherine brought a different kind of knowledge to the ranch. She could read and write fluently, could do arithmetic quickly in her head, and she offered to help Matthew with his account books, which he had been neglecting. They worked together in easy companionship, and Katherine found herself looking forward to their evening conversations. Matthew was well-read despite his lack of formal education, and he had strong opinions about politics, literature, and the state of the world. He treated her as an equal, asking for her thoughts and actually listening to her responses, which was more than any man in her previous life had ever done. One evening about 2 weeks after her arrival, Katherine was washing dishes when Matthew came in from checking on a horse that had seemed lame that morning. She had rolled up the sleeves of her borrowed shirt, and her arms were wet to the elbows from the soapy water. "How is the mare?" she asked. "Better, just a stone in her hoof." Matthew hung his hat on the peg by the door and watched her for a moment. "You know, you have taken to ranch life better than I expected," Katherine smiled. "I had a good teacher. Still, most women from your background would not have stuck it out." "Most women from my background have other options," Katherine said quietly. Matthew crossed the room and stood beside her at the wash basin. "You have got options too, Katherine. You do not have to stay here if you do not want to. I have saved a bit of money. I could stake you for a train ticket somewhere, help you start fresh in a new city." Katherine's hands stilled in the water. The thought of leaving filled her with an unexpected sense of loss. "Is that what you want, for me to leave?" "No," Matthew said immediately. "But I do not want you to feel trapped here either." Katherine dried her hands on a towel and turned to face him. "I do not feel trapped. For the first time in my life, I feel free. I know it probably seems strange, given that I am doing manual labor and living in a storage room, but I have never been happier." Something shifted in the air between them, a charge of awareness that made Katherine's breath catch. Matthew's eyes searched hers, and she saw her own feelings reflected back at her. He cared for her, she realized, and she cared for him. "Katherine," he said softly, then seemed to catch himself. He stepped back, putting distance between them. "I am glad you are happy here." The moment passed, but something had changed. Katherine found herself noticing things about Matthew she had not paid attention to before. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he handled the animals, the sound of his laughter. She caught him watching her sometimes, his expression unguarded, and she wondered if he was fighting the same feelings she was. The situation was complicated by propriety. They were living under the same roof, unmarried and unchaperoned, which would have been scandalous in her old life. But out here, miles from town with no one to see or judge, the rules seemed less important. What mattered was the work they did together, the life they were building, the quiet understanding that had grown between them. One afternoon in late September, Matthew announced they needed to go into Marysville for supplies. Katherine felt a flutter of anxiety at the prospect of facing the town again, but she knew it was inevitable. She had been hiding on the ranch for over a month, and she could not avoid civilization forever. She changed into her carefully mended dress, which had been washed and pressed as well as she could manage. Matthew had bought her a simple bonnet from a peddler who had passed through the week before, and she tied it under her chin with nervous fingers. The ride into town took several hours, and Katherine felt her stomach twist into knots as the familiar buildings came into view. She kept her head high as they rode down the main street, aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Matthew stayed close beside her, his presence a solid comfort. They stopped at the general store, and Katherine waited outside while Matthew went in to purchase flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities. She heard voices drifting through the open door, heard the shopkeeper ask Matthew about that Bennett girl, heard Matthew's firm response that Miss Bennett was working as his housekeeper, and that anyone who had a problem with it could take it up with him. Katherine's cheeks burned, but she was grateful for his defense. When Matthew emerged with his purchases, he helped her mount her horse, and they rode to the mercantile on the other end of town, where he insisted on buying her fabric for 2 new dresses. "You cannot keep wearing my shirts," he said when she protested. "And I am sure you are tired of that same dress." Katherine selected the simplest fabrics she could find, sturdy cotton in practical colors, but even so, the cost made her wince. Matthew paid without complaint, then added thread, needles, and a few other sewing notions to the pile. As they were leaving the mercantile, a familiar voice called out, "Katherine, Katherine Bennett." Katherine turned to see Louisa Morrison, who had been one of her closest friends before the falling out with her father. Louisa rushed forward, her face a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Katherine, we have all been so worried. The rumors have been terrible. Your father told everyone you had run off with some drifter, but I did not believe it." Louisa's eyes flicked to Matthew, taking in his work-worn clothes and the easy way he stood beside Katherine. "Is this man bothering you? Do you need help?" "No," Katherine said firmly. "Mr. Cole has been very kind to me. He gave me work when I had nowhere else to go." Louisa's eyebrows rose. "Work? Katherine, you are living with a man unchaperoned. Surely you realize what people are saying." "Let them say what they like," Katherine replied, surprised by her own boldness. "I would rather work for an honest man than return to a house where I was valued only as a bargaining chip." "But your reputation," Louisa whispered urgently. "How will you ever marry?" Katherine glanced at Matthew, who was studying a spot on the horizon with great interest, clearly trying to give them the illusion of privacy. "I suppose I will marry someone who cares more about my character than about gossip." Louisa shook her head, her expression pitying. "I hope you know what you are doing." She turned to go, then paused. "For what it is worth, I always thought your father was too hard on you. You deserved better." After Louisa left, Katherine and Matthew rode out of town in silence. Katherine felt raw and exposed, as though Louisa's words had stripped away the protective cocoon of the ranch and forced her to confront the reality of her situation. She was ruined in society's eyes, unmarriageable, damaged goods. "Does it bother you?" Matthew asked as they left the town behind. "What people say, it should," Katherine said. "I was raised to care very much about what people think. But honestly, I find that I do not. Or at least, I care less about the opinions of people who would judge me than I do about living a life that feels true to myself." Matthew smiled at her, and there was something in his eyes that made Katherine's heart skip. "You are a remarkable woman, Katherine Bennett." The weeks that followed were some of the happiest Katherine had ever known. She finished sewing her new dresses, taking pride in the somewhat uneven stitches that proved she had made them herself. She learned to cook more complicated meals, and while she would never be a great chef, her biscuits were at least edible. She could ride competently now, could help Matthew move cattle from one pasture to another, could handle a rope with basic proficiency. But more than the skills she was learning, she treasured the life she was building. She woke each morning with a sense of purpose, spent her days doing meaningful work, and fell asleep each night satisfied with her accomplishments. And through it all, her feelings for Matthew continued to grow. She loved the way he hummed while he worked, loved his dry sense of humor and his generous spirit. She loved how he never talked down to her, how he respected her opinions even when he disagreed with them. She loved the way he cared for his animals, the way he kept his word, the way he had taken her in without expecting anything in return. Matthew, for his part, seemed to be struggling with his own feelings. Katherine caught him watching her with an expression of longing that he quickly hid whenever he noticed her looking back. He was careful never to touch her unnecessarily, maintaining a respectful distance that Katherine increasingly wanted him to breach. The tension between them built like a summer storm, heavy and electric, until one evening in October when everything changed. They had spent the day rounding up cattle that had wandered into a neighboring property, and they returned to the ranch exhausted and filthy. Matthew had been kicked by a particularly ornery steer, and there was a nasty bruise forming on his shoulder. Katherine insisted on tending to it, fetching water and clean cloths while Matthew protested that he was fine. "Sit down and let me help you," Katherine said firmly, and Matthew obeyed with a resigned sigh. She helped him remove his shirt, trying not to notice the sculpted muscles of his chest and arms, the way his skin was tan from working in the sun. She gently cleaned the dirt from the wound and applied a poultice her mother had taught her to make years ago, back when Katherine had thought she might like to study medicine before her father had dismissed the idea as unsuitable. Her fingers lingered on Matthew's shoulder and she felt him tense beneath her touch. When she looked up, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Katherine," he said, his voice rough, "we should not do this." "Do what?" she asked, though she knew perfectly well what he meant. "You know what? I care about you more than I should, but you deserve better than a dirt-poor rancher with nothing to offer you." Katherine's temper flared. "Do not presume to tell me what I deserve. And for your information, you have offered me more than anyone else in my life. You have given me respect, friendship, and a place to belong. How is that nothing?" Matthew stood abruptly, putting distance between them. "You are young, Katherine. You have your whole life ahead of you. Someday, your father might forgive you, or you might meet someone with the means to give you the life you were meant to have." "The life I was meant to have," Katherine repeated, her voice rising. "I was meant to be sold to the highest bidder, to spend my days hosting dinner parties and pretending to be happy while my soul withered away. Is that the life you think I should want?" "You know what I mean," Matthew said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "You are educated, refined. You speak languages and play the piano. What kind of life is this for you? Mucking out stalls and mending fences?" Katherine crossed the room to stand directly in front of him. "It is the life I choose, and if you would stop being so noble for one moment, you might realize that I am happy here. That I am happy with you." The words hung in the air between them, a confession that could not be taken back. Matthew looked at her with such longing that Katherine's heart ached. "I love you," she said simply. "I know I am not supposed to say it first, that ladies are supposed to wait for men to declare themselves, but I do not care about those rules anymore. I love you, Matthew Cole, and if you feel the same way, then nothing else matters." For a long moment, Matthew did not move. Then he cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle, and kissed her. It was Katherine's first kiss, and it was everything she had never known she wanted. Tender and passionate, reverent and desperate all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he said. "I have loved you since the first morning I saw you trying to milk the cow and talking to it like it was a person. I have loved watching you transform from someone who did not know which end of a chicken to feed into someone who can handle any challenge thrown at you. But Katherine, are you sure? Once we do this, once we make this choice, there is no going back. You will be bound to this life, to this ranch, to me." "I have never been more sure of anything," Katherine said. They married the following week in a simple ceremony at the small church in Marysville. The minister looked at them with some skepticism, clearly aware of the scandal surrounding Katherine's departure from her father's house, but he performed the service when Matthew paid him double his usual fee. There were no guests, no flowers, no celebration. Just two people pledging their lives to each other in a dusty church on a Tuesday afternoon. Katherine wore one of the new dresses she had made, and Matthew wore his best shirt with his hair freshly trimmed. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to Katherine's eyes. They signed the register as Mr. and Mrs. Matthew Cole, and Katherine felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. That night, in the privacy of their ranch, Matthew carried Katherine over the threshold of what had been his room and was now their room. He had cleaned and reorganized, making space for her belongings, and there were wildflowers in a jar on the small table by the window. "I know it is not fancy," Matthew said, suddenly nervous. Katherine silenced him with a kiss. "It is perfect." Their wedding night was awkward and tender, both of them inexperienced but eager to learn. Matthew was patient and gentle, making sure Katherine felt safe and cherished. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Katherine felt a profound sense of peace. This was where she belonged, in the arms of a man who loved her for who she was, not what she could do for him. The months that followed were not without challenges. Winter came hard that year, with heavy snows that made simple tasks difficult and dangerous. They lost a few cattle to the cold, and there were days when Matthew worked himself to exhaustion trying to keep the rest of the herd alive. Katherine learned to manage the house in the harshest conditions, to keep the fire going, to stretch their supplies when they could not make it to town for weeks at a time. But they faced every challenge together, and their love grew deeper with each obstacle they overcame. On quiet evenings, they would sit by the fire, Katherine reading aloud from one of Matthew's few books while he mended tack or carved small figurines from scraps of wood. They talked about their dreams for the future, about expanding the ranch, about the children they hoped to have someday. In the spring, Katherine discovered she was pregnant. She had been feeling unwell for several weeks, and when she finally connected the symptoms, joy and terror flooded through her in equal measure. She told Matthew one evening after supper, and he swept her into his arms with a whoop of delight that scared the chickens roosting outside. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "I am going to be a father." Katherine laughed through her tears. "Yes, you are. Are you ready?" "Probably not," Matthew admitted, "but we will figure it out together, just like we have figured out everything else." The pregnancy was difficult for Katherine. She spent the first few months violently ill, able to keep down only plain crackers and weak tea. Matthew hovered over her anxiously, trying to take on all her chores in addition to his own, until Katherine finally insisted she was not an invalid and needed to keep working, or she would go mad from boredom. As her belly grew, Katherine found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed. A year ago, she had been a pampered daughter living in a mansion, her biggest concern being which dress to wear to which social function. Now she was a rancher's wife, her hands permanently roughened from work, her skin tanned from the sun, her body carrying new life, and she had never been happier. Matthew treated her pregnancy with reverence, often placing his hands on her swelling belly to feel the baby kick. He talked to their unborn child constantly, telling stories about the ranch and making promises about the life they would build together. In November of 1879, after 12 hours of labor attended by a midwife from town, Katherine gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Samuel Richard Cole, the middle name a tentative olive branch to the grandfather the child might never meet. Samuel had Matthew's dark hair and Katherine's green eyes, and he was perfect in every way. Watching Matthew cradle their son for the first time, Katherine felt her heart might burst from happiness. This man, who had taken her in when she had nothing, who had given her not just shelter but love and respect and partnership, was now the father of her child. They were a family, bound together by more than just circumstance or obligation, but by genuine affection and commitment. The first year of Samuel's life was exhausting. Katherine had not realized how much work an infant required, how little sleep she would get, how overwhelming it could feel to be responsible for such a tiny, fragile life. But Matthew was a devoted father, walking the floor with Samuel when he cried at night, changing soiled diapers without complaint and marveling at every small milestone. The ranch prospered during this time. Matthew had made smart investments, buying more land and better breeding stock. Katherine's management of the household accounts proved invaluable, as she found ways to save money and maximize their resources. They hired a young man named Jack to help with the heavy labor, which gave Matthew more time to spend with his family. When Samuel was 18 months old, Katherine discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. She continued working as long as she was able, only stopping her outdoor chores in the final weeks before the birth. Their second child, a daughter they named Emma Grace, was born in June of 1881. She had Matthew's brown eyes and Katherine's delicate features, and Samuel was fascinated by his new sister, wanting to help with everything from diaper changes to feedings. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The children grew, the ranch flourished, and Katherine and Matthew's love deepened with each passing year. They faced hardships, of course. There were droughts that tested their water supply, cattle rustlers that required Matthew to spend nights guarding the herd, illnesses that swept through the children and left Katherine praying desperately for their recovery. But they weathered each storm together, their partnership stronger for having been tested. Katherine never saw her father again. She had sent him a letter announcing her marriage, then later announcements of Samuel and Emma's births, but she received no response. She heard through the town gossip that he had suffered a stroke and that his business was failing, but even then, he did not reach out. Katherine made her peace with it, recognizing that some wounds were too deep to heal. Her mother, however, surprised her by appearing at the ranch one spring afternoon in 1883. Katherine was in the garden with Emma when a fancy carriage pulled up the drive. Margaret Bennett stepped out, looking frailer than Katherine remembered but with a determined set to her jaw. "Mother," Katherine said, frozen in surprise. "May I come in?" Margaret asked quietly. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Katherine had eaten her first meal at the ranch 5 years earlier, and Margaret wept as she apologized for her silence, for her cowardice in not defending Katherine when it mattered. "Your father is a difficult man," Margaret said. "But that is no excuse. You are my daughter and I should have fought for you." Katherine felt tears sliding down her own cheeks. "You are here now. That is what matters." Margaret stayed for a week, getting to know her grandchildren and marveling at the life Katherine had built. She helped with cooking and mending, and she and Katherine stayed up late talking about everything they had missed in each other's lives. When it was time for Margaret to leave, she embraced Katherine tightly. "You are happy," Margaret said. "It was not a question." "I am," Katherine confirmed. "Happier than I ever was in that big house on the hill." "Your father was wrong about many things," Margaret said, "but he was most wrong about you. You are stronger than either of us ever knew." Margaret visited twice more before her death the following year. Katherine grieved for her mother, but she was grateful they had reconciled, that Margaret had seen the life Katherine had chosen and understood it was a good life. The years continued to pass. Samuel grew into a sturdy boy who loved working alongside his father, learning the cattle business from the ground up. Emma was more interested in books and learning, and Katherine taught her to read and do sums, delighting in her daughter's quick mind. In 1885, Katherine gave birth to twin boys, Daniel and Thomas, who kept the entire household in chaos with their endless energy and mischief. The ranch grew to be one of the most successful in the region. Matthew's reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle spread, and he was able to command premium prices at market. They built a larger house, with proper bedrooms for each child and even a small parlor where Katherine's old piano, purchased from an estate sale, sat gleaming. She played for her family in the evenings, teaching the children simple songs and filling the house with music. Katherine's transformation from society daughter to ranch wife was complete. She could handle a rifle, birth a calf, cook for a dozen ranch hands, and keep accurate books. But she never forgot where she had come from, and she made sure to instill in her children the values she had learned. Hard work, integrity, compassion for those less fortunate, and the courage to stand up for what they believed in. One evening in the summer of 1888, 10 years after Katherine had been cast out by her father, she and Matthew sat on the porch watching the sunset while their children played in the yard. Samuel was teaching Daniel and Thomas to rope fence posts, while Emma read a book in the shade of the big oak tree they had planted when she was born. "You ever regret it?" Matthew asked, reaching for Katherine's hand. "Giving up your old life?" Katherine threaded her fingers through his and smiled. "Not for a single moment. That life was never really mine. It belonged to my father's vision of who I should be. This life, this ranch, these children, this is all mine. This is who I chose to be." Matthew lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I thank God every day that you walked into my life. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "We are the best things that ever happened to each other," Katherine corrected, leaning her head on his shoulder. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had been unwanted, cast out, left to fend for herself in a world that did not value women who dared to make their own choices. But she had survived. More than that, she had thrived, building a life filled with love, purpose, and genuine happiness. Matthew Cole had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go, but he had given her so much more than shelter. He had given her respect, partnership, and unconditional love. He had seen her not as a commodity or a disappointment, but as a person of value and potential. And together, they had created something beautiful. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joys and sorrows. Samuel married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, a practical young woman named Sarah who fit seamlessly into the Cole family. They built a house on the northern section of the ranch and worked the land alongside Matthew. Emma, true to her bookish nature, became a schoolteacher in Marysville, though she lived at home and rode to town each day. The twins, Daniel and Thomas, were inseparable and spent their youth getting into every kind of trouble imaginable. But they had good hearts, and as they grew older, they channeled their energy into expanding the ranch's operations, experimenting with new breeding techniques and crops. Katherine became a grandmother at 45. When Samuel and Sarah welcomed a daughter they named Katherine Margaret, after both her grandmothers. Holding her tiny namesake in her arms, Katherine marveled at the passage of time, at the life that had grown from those dark days when she had slept beneath an oak tree with no hope for the future. Matthew's hair turned silver, and lines deepened around his eyes, but to Katherine, he was as handsome as the day he had found her in that grove. They celebrated their silver wedding anniversary in 1903, with all their children and grandchildren gathered around them. And Katherine looked at the faces of the people she loved most in the world and felt profoundly blessed. Her father had been dead for years, his fortune divided among distant relatives after his business finally collapsed. Katherine had felt nothing when she heard the news, only a vague sadness that he had wasted his life chasing wealth and status while missing out on the things that truly mattered. On a warm evening in late summer of 1910, Katherine and Matthew sat in their favorite spot on the porch. They were both in their 70s now, slowed by age but still active, still engaged with the ranch and their family. 5 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren had been added to the family, and the ranch had grown to over 1,000 acres, managed primarily by Samuel and the twins. "Did I ever tell you about the day I found you under that oak tree?" Matthew asked, his voice still strong despite his age. "Only about 100 times," Katherine said with a smile, "but I never get tired of hearing it. I had just finished a job driving cattle north, and I was bone-tired, ready to get home and sleep for a week. But something made me take the long route through town, and I saw you walking toward that grove. You held your head so high, even though I could see you were terrified. I knew right then you were special." "I was not feeling very special at the moment," Katherine admitted. "I felt like my whole world had ended." "In a way it had," Matthew said, "but that made room for a new world to begin. A better world." Katherine rested her head on his shoulder, just as she had done countless times over the past 32 years. "Thank you for taking me in. Thank you for loving me." "Best decision I ever made," Matthew said, kissing the top of her head. "You gave me everything I never knew I wanted. A home full of love, children who make me proud, a partnership that has made every day better than the last. I am the luckiest man alive." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had witnessed Katherine's despair on that night so long ago, now witnessing her contentment. The sounds of the ranch surrounded them, cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving in their stalls, the creak of the windmill turning in the breeze. These were the sounds of home, the soundtrack to a life well lived. Inside the house, they could hear Emma helping prepare supper, could hear Samuel's deep laugh as he played with one of the grandchildren. The ranch that Matthew had built alone, and that Katherine had helped him expand, was now a legacy for their children and grandchildren. A testament to what two people could accomplish when they worked together with love and determination. As they rose to go inside for supper, Matthew took Katherine's hand, and she smiled up at him. The unwanted daughter who had been cast out had found her place in the world. The cowboy who had taken her in had gained far more than he had given. Together, they had built not just a ranch, but a life filled with the kind of love Katherine had always needed but had never known existed until Matthew Cole offered her his hand on that dark night so many years ago. The years that followed were peaceful ones, filled with the simple pleasures of watching their family grow and thrive. Katherine and Matthew remained active in the ranch operations as long as they were able, offering guidance to their children and grandchildren while gradually stepping back to let the next generation take the lead. Katherine maintained her lifelong habit of reading, and she established a small lending library in Marysville, ensuring that other young women had access to books and education. She became known throughout the county as someone who would help young women in difficult situations, offering advice, connections, and sometimes sanctuary when they needed it most. She never forgot that she had once been the girl with nowhere to go, and she made sure no other woman in her community had to face that alone. Matthew served on the town council for several years, using his position to advocate for fair water rights and better roads. He was respected by everyone who knew him, not because of wealth or status, but because of his integrity and his commitment to doing right by his neighbors. In the spring of 1915, Katherine and Matthew celebrated their 37th wedding anniversary surrounded by 4 generations of their family. There were now 7 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren, with more on the way. The ranch had become one of the most prosperous in California, known for quality cattle and ethical business practices. That evening, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Katherine and Matthew walked hand in hand through the property, revisiting the places that held special meaning. The barn where they had worked together during that first winter. The field where Matthew had taught her to ride. The oak tree where they had planted Emma's tree. The small cemetery on the hill where they had buried Catherine's mother, and, more recently, Matthew's brother who had reconciled with him before his death. "No regrets?" Matthew asked as they stood looking out over the land they had shaped together. "Not a single one," Katherine said firmly. "This life exceeded every dream I never dared to have." "I love you, Katherine Cole," Matthew said, turning to face her. "I have loved you from the beginning, and I will love you until the end." "And I love you," Katherine replied, reaching up to touch his weathered face. "You gave me everything. You gave me myself." They returned to the house as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Inside, the house was quiet, the children and grandchildren having finally settled down for the night. Katherine and Matthew prepared for bed with the practiced ease of a couple who had spent decades together, each knowing the other's routines without needing to speak. As they lay in bed that night, Matthew's arms around her, Katherine thought about the girl she had been at 20, frightened and alone, certain her life was over. She wished she could go back and tell that girl that everything would be all right, that the pain she was feeling would fade, that she would find a love more profound than anything she had imagined possible. But perhaps it was better that her younger self had not known. Perhaps the journey had been necessary, the hardship essential to forging the strength and character that had carried her through life. She had learned to value the things that truly mattered: love, family, hard work, integrity. She had learned that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. She had learned that home was not a place but a feeling, and that family was built not just by blood but by choice and commitment. Matthew's breathing had deepened, and Katherine knew he had fallen asleep. She lay awake a bit longer, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch at night, feeling the warmth of her husband beside her, thinking about all the years behind them and however many might still lie ahead. She had been the unwanted daughter, cast out by a father who saw her as nothing more than a failed investment. But Matthew Cole had seen her true worth, had taken her in and given her not just shelter but respect, partnership, and love. He had helped her discover her own strength, her own capabilities, her own value. And she, in turn, had given him a family, a true home, a partnership that had enriched every aspect of his life. They had built something beautiful together, something that would endure long after they were gone. As Katherine finally drifted off to sleep, secure in Matthew's embrace, she felt profound gratitude for the path her life had taken. She had lost one family only to gain another, better one. She had been forced to leave behind a life of privilege and ease, only to discover a life of purpose and fulfillment. She had thought her life was ending that day her father cast her out, but really, it had just been beginning. The unwanted daughter had become a beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and pillar of her community. The cowboy who had taken her in had gained a partner who made him better, stronger, happier. Together, they had created a legacy of love that would echo through generations. And on that warm summer night in 1915, surrounded by the life they had built together, Katherine Bennett Cole fell asleep smiling, her heart full of peace, her life complete. She had been given the love she had always needed, and she had given it in return, and that made all the difference in the world.